On April 30th, 1945, as the Allies were closing in on Berlin, Hitler chose to end his life rather than face capture by ingesting a lethal dose of cyanide and then shooting himself. A week later, on May 8th, the German High Command unconditionally surrendered to the Allies, and World War II came to an end in Europe. But the other war, the one that had been raging east to west across a vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, continued on. For months after Germany surrendered, members of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, and 6th U.S. Marine Corps divisions continued fighting savagely, island to island, until they finally reached Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where they faced some of the most violent resistance of the entire Pacific campaign. Japanese defenders had carved out a network of underground fortifications with the intention of turning the small island into a death trap and had to be dug out, man by man, from the island's volcanic terrain. On Iwo Jima alone, U.S. landing forces lost 6,821 men, with another 19,217 being wounded in action. On Okinawa, heavy rains and rugged terrain made ease of movement impossible, while the island was covered in a natural defensive position. The vicious land, sea, and air battle raged for nearly 3 months, and of the roughly 60,000 soldiers and Marines that stormed ashore, 12,000 were killed in action. Estimates say that 90,000 Japanese combatants and 150,000 Okinawan civilians also died during the fighting. But even after losing well over 100,000 soldiers themselves during the combined battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japan still showed no signs of surrender. Apparently, they fully intended to stick with their overall strategy of attrition and endurance. If they could wear the US down enough, they believed, by continuing to throw wave after wave of drafted soldiers against them, the leadership in Washington would have no choice but to concede the Pacific theater to the Emperor and go home. But we all know that's not what happened. By this point, it had been nearly 4 years since Pearl Harbor had been attacked, and it certainly seemed that Japanese officials, as well as Emperor Hirohito himself, were underestimating the desire and determination felt not just by President Harry S. Truman and the American people, but much of the rest of the world to bring this war to an end. It's important to point out here as well that Truman had only been president since April 12, 1945, moving up from his position as vice president after the untimely death of former President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Which means that only a month into Truman's time as president, a heck of a lot had happened. Hitler was dead, Nazism was over, Europe was free. Even the Soviet Union had launched a massive offensive against Japanese positions in Manchuria, Northern Korea, and the Kuril Islands. And now, after wresting Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Macon, Saipan, Guam, and Pililu from the grip of the Japanese, the Marines had finally reached the islands nearest to the Japanese mainland, meaning that if President Truman wanted to invade mainland Japan, he was certainly now in a position to do so. But things were going pretty well for the newly appointed commander-in-chief, so there might have been a strong personal incentive for him, one could assume, to keep his win streak alive. And there was definitely no guaranteeing that a full-scale ground invasion of Japan would be at all successful. At the very least, millions of lives would be lost, or so his advisors were telling him. What was absolutely clear for most of the world by this point was that the Japanese advance had been turned back. The Allies had taken the advantage, and it was time for Japan to surrender. But we all know now that's not what happened either. Not immediately anyway. No. Not until September 1945, after the US dropped not 1 but 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, did Japan agree to unconditionally surrender, effectively bringing World War II to an end. When the news of the bombings ultimately spread, it left much of the world in a collective state of awe, horror, and disbelief. And arguably, the use of these new weapons changed the notion of global warfare forever. Even the people largely responsible for inventing the atomic bomb were left questioning the morality of what they'd done. In fact, the leading physicist on the project, the infamous J. Robert Oppenheimer, fell into a deep depression after learning of the devastation that had resulted from the bombings. "I feel I have blood on my hands," he is reported to have said to President Truman. Also in the wake of the bombings, and the US taking its position as the first nuclear power state, there were a lot of questions that needed answers. And one of them was, why wasn't Tokyo, Japan's capital city, chosen as a target? Why was Tokyo spared while Hiroshima and Nagasaki were mostly annihilated? The short answer is, it wasn't. In fact, Tokyo, along with 68 other Japanese cities, may have suffered an even worse fate. A worse fate than being nuked. You might be asking this perhaps with a bit of disbelief. Well, it depends on how you look at it. Essentially, it depends on how one chooses to objectively measure the horrors of war, if such a thing is even possible. The question we'd have to ask would be this: is one bomb killing 100,000 people in a matter of seconds worse than thousands of bombs killing perhaps even more people over a matter of months? Is dying after the fact from radiation poisoning worse than dying days or weeks later from extensive burn injuries, exposure, or starvation? The weight of a tragedy often gets determined by how well it's remembered, but that certainly isn't a foolproof measurement either. You see, when the war ended, the world was in a big hurry to either celebrate or demonize America's use of the atomic bomb. And in doing so, we looked right past what was actually the single deadliest bombing campaign in the history of aerial warfare. Why wasn't Tokyo nuked, you ask? Well, because by the summer of 1945, Tokyo practically didn't exist at all. But to properly understand the sheer devastation of Tokyo, it's important to zoom out and take a look at a few other important pieces of information. Firstly, it'll be easier for us to grasp the bigger picture here if we understand what sort of weapon was used on Japan's capital city. Then, we should also take a look at the man whose idea it was to use it so uninhibitedly. The weapon we're talking about, that US bombers rained down on Tokyo along with 68 other Japanese cities, is napalm. Essentially a sticky gel-like substance with a gasoline base. When napalm is sprayed from, let's say, a flamethrower, it clings to whatever it lands on, creating fires that are nearly impossible to extinguish. And when dropped from, let's say, an aircraft, it typically erupts into massive runaway firestorms that can be especially effective for destroying wood structures, which is what Tokyo mostly consisted of in 1945. During World War II, while the atomic bomb was still being developed, the need arose for a more effective incendiary weapon to use for aerial bombing missions. So, scientists in the US were tasked with developing a substance that could create intense fires capable of destroying a range of enemy targets. They started experimenting with various combinations of chemicals, and a Harvard organic chemist named Julius Fieser eventually came up with a combination of naphthenic acid and palmitic acid that resulted in what was essentially a thickening agent for gasoline. And that's how the world got napalm. Despite its use during World War II and the Korean War, however, the controversy surrounding its use in combat wouldn't reach the attention of the general public in any meaningful way until the Vietnam War, largely due to consistent television coverage. Outrage sparked by the war in Vietnam, including the use of napalm, spread across the globe, and as a result, a number of international agreements were put in place to restrict its use, especially in areas populated by civilians. The last reported use of napalm in combat was during the Gulf War. The bombs the US used then, however, despite being referred to as napalm, actually contained an improved version of the original substance. Even so, napalm and similar incendiary weapons have continued to be the subject of much international debate and scrutiny. Another element contributing to this controversy is that the most effective way to deploy napalm has always been via non-precision aerial bombing techniques, which is in itself highly controversial. Despite the increased reliance on aerial bombing by many modern militaries, the use of this tactic has never been straightforward. In fact, broad questions surrounding the necessity and morality of large-scale aerial bombings have been asked continuously since its very first use back in 1937, during the Spanish Civil War. Guernica, Spain, was the first city to wake up to a deluge of bombs raining down from the sky, an act carried out by the German Luftwaffe and Italian Royal Air Force that would become a symbol of the cruelty that loomed heavily over the largely political conflict. As the story is commonly told, the day of the bombing was a well-known event when farmers from the surrounding region would come to town to sell their produce. That day, the Luftwaffe knew the town would be particularly crowded with vendors, shoppers, animals, and curious residents of Guernica. Some historians believe, but it hasn't been definitively proven, that the Germans deliberately targeted the city on this day in order to inflict maximum casualties. For many years, the number of reported deaths had been over 1,700, but these numbers were later revealed to have been generously exaggerated by the government in Madrid. Most historians now agree that the number of deaths was somewhere around 200, a horrific event no matter how you look at it, especially given that very few of the casualties were military, and that many of those who were killed had left the safety of air raid shelters between waves of attacks, mistakenly believing the bombings had ended. The bombing of Guernica, however, does not stand alone as a controversial act of war that's been almost completely overshadowed by the use of the atomic bomb. About a month prior to the firebombing of Tokyo, the city of Dresden, Germany was also mercilessly bombarded and extensively burned up. Well, this attack, carried out by British and American allied forces, unfolded as a series of raids intended to disrupt German transportation and communication lines, as well as to lower the morale of the German population. And this seemed to accomplish, and then some. For nearly 2 days, in the middle of February of 1945, 800 bombers dropped around 2,700 tons of explosives and incendiary bombs on Dresden. An estimated 25,000 people were killed, mostly civilians, and nearly the entire city was either destroyed or set ablaze. This lesser-known wartime atrocity didn't reach the attention of many people, especially in America, until the famed American novelist Kurt Vonnegut wrote about the bombing in his 1969 novel Slaughterhouse-Five, which was based in part on his own experiences as a prisoner of war during that time. Vonnegut, an American soldier, was captured by the Germans during the famous Battle of the Bulge and was being held in Dresden when the city was bombed. After the bombing, still as a POW, Vonnegut was assigned to a cleanup crew, where he was given the duty of digging down into bomb shelters and basements that had been buried by debris. We can imagine the young future author finally gaining entry to one of these shelters just to find everyone inside still sitting around in chairs or along the walls, all dead due to a lack of precious oxygen, which had instantly been consumed by the surrounding firestorm. Those aware of the bombing, especially the Germans, were outraged. Because Dresden was believed to have limited military significance and yet was almost completely leveled, the bombing itself has remained a highly controversial event. While Slaughterhouse-Five, a unique blend of science fiction, autobiography, and anti-war sentiment, has remained an enduring classic anti-war novel in which Vonnegut uses his own traumatic experiences to eliminate the horrors of war. The bombing of Dresden was intended to terrorize Germany's civilian population and encourage their surrender, an ominous foreshadowing of the tactics as well as the horrors of the firebombing campaign that would later ravage Japan. For the German High Command, however, the deaths of 25,000 soldiers, civilians, and refugees, along with the near-total destruction of what at the time was thought to be the cultural and artistic heart of Germany, was still not enough to convince them to throw in the towel. Not for another 3 months, anyway. Okay, what about 100,000 people? Apparently not. Because as the world would soon discover, not even the incineration of half of Tokyo would be enough to convince Japan's leadership to give in. Not by a long shot. Wait a minute. How do 100,000 people get killed and hundreds of thousands more get injured during a single bombing? How do 24 square kilometers, or 15 square miles for the Americans, of one of the world's most densely populated urban areas, an area about half the size of Manhattan, get burned almost completely to the ground? Here's how. On the night of March 9th, 1945, from around 0130 to 0300, 5 months before the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a swarm of some 334 B-29 heavy bombers took off from newly established air bases in the Mariana Islands, bound for Tokyo. And in the space of just a few hours, they dropped 1,667 tons of napalm-filled incendiary bombs on the Japanese capital. Under the cover of darkness, some 500,000 M69 incendiary bomblets would rain down on the sleeping city. Imagine each cluster of bomblets spreading out during its descent from around 5,000 feet, each one spewing flaming liquid in every direction upon impact. These low-altitude nighttime raids marked a significant shift in the strategy being used by the US Air Force bomber groups. They'd stopped relying on B-17 flying fortresses, and the torch had been passed to the new, state-of-the-art, long-range B-29 superfortress, of which there were hundreds, ready to go, waiting at American air bases on the newly acquired islands of Saipan and Tinian. And who, you might be asking, was behind this diabolical change in tactics? Meet Curtis Emerson LeMay, a U.S. Air Force general whose many nicknames included Old Iron Pants, the Demon, and perhaps most fitting, Bombs Away LeMay. LeMay joined the United States Army Air Corps, the precursor to the U.S. Air Force, in 1929. And by the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, LeMay had risen to the rank of major. By August of 1944, he oversaw all strategic bombing operations in the Pacific Theater. By the time of his promotion, LeMay already had several tactical and operational concerns about conventional aerial bombing, starting with the unsettling fact that the armada of B-29s flying from China were hitting their intended targets only 5% of the time. It's certainly possible that the bombers were flying too high and too fast to be consistently accurate. The combination of ongoing mechanical issues with the B-29, combined with Japan's daytime air defense capabilities, had amounted to an unacceptable number of aircraft being lost. LeMay quickly developed a reputation for being a bit of a bomb-first, ask-questions-later type of strategist, and during his later career, he would orchestrate airstrikes against North Korea and Vietnam, and was among an advisory committee. That also included the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and the director of the CIA that presented President John F. Kennedy with plans for a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. Therefore, if the job was to bomb an entire country into submission, LeMay seemed to be just the right man for it, especially as the hesitation about this sort of strategy declined as World War II carried on. Despite President Franklin D. Roosevelt's initial insistence that all governments refrain from the barbarism of bombing civilian populations, by 1945 that policy had clearly changed. The general attitude about ethical bombing methods started to shift after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and the US became utterly determined to retaliate. Soon after the US officially entered the war, military strategists began putting together a list of targets to obliterate. From aircraft bases to ball bearing factories, anything that might hinder the Japanese war effort. And with Bombs Away LeMay in charge of strategy, when it came time to hit Japan back, there would be another shift. Not in the ethics of aerial warfare, but in the effectiveness of aerial bombing tactics, regardless of the intended target. LeMay looked at the many challenges associated with high-altitude bombing, including inaccurate targeting methods and unpredictable jet stream and weather conditions, and he started making practical, strategic adjustments. According to LeMay's new strategy, bombers would approach at lower altitudes, under the cover of darkness and in a single-file line. These new tactics would take the place of the large, multi-layered formations the US had been using for daylight bombing runs in Europe. Another idea LeMay had, this one intended to maximize the available payload of the B-29s making the 7-hour flight to Tokyo for the hellacious firebombing campaign codenamed Operation Meeting House, was to strip the aircrafts of all non-essential equipment. Some didn't even carry defensive guns or the gunners who'd have normally operated them. And to be even more sure that the raid would achieve maximum devastation, Army engineers prepared maps of Tokyo's most flammable sectors, knowing that the low-rise wooden buildings that comprised most of the city would burn incredibly hot. The first bombers to reach the target dropped smaller payloads before circling back, starting 5 sets of marking fires for the rest of the bombers to use as visual targets. In some areas of the city, the unstoppable fires reached temperatures of nearly 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, or 1,000 degrees Celsius. That's the same temperature as the flame of a typical oxyacetylene welding torch. Aluminum melts at approximately 1,220 degrees Fahrenheit, or 660 degrees Celsius, and water boils at just 212 degrees Fahrenheit, or 100 degrees Celsius. The heat was reportedly so intense that entire canals boiled, metal structures melted, and not just buildings, but people simply burst spontaneously into flames. Crewmen on some of the returning B-29s, as they headed back to their respective bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, reported seeing a red glow from the burning city 150 miles or 250 kilometers away, as an open inferno of flames and smoke rose nearly 18,000 feet or 5,500 meters up into the sky. Witnesses who experienced the event from the ground reported unimaginable horrors. Roadways became rivers of fire as everything burned. Homes, along with all their contents, disappeared behind walls of towering flames. Animals ran around on fire. Even babies were burned alive, while still strapped to the backs of their fleeing parents. "If we'd lost the war," General LeMay is reported to have said, "we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals." Instead, he was labeled as a hero, awarded numerous medals, and later tasked with leading the U.S. Strategic Air Command, the division of the Air Force responsible for the organization, training, and equipping of the U.S.'s strategic bomber squadrons, and later its intercontinental ballistic missile forces. But the March bombing wasn't the end for Tokyo. The Japanese capital was firebombed again on April 14th and 18th, and again on May 24th and 26th, expanding the burned-out area to 1.5 times the size of Manhattan. So while this is the primary reason Tokyo wasn't chosen as a target for the atomic bomb, it doesn't explain why Nagasaki and Hiroshima were ultimately chosen. It also doesn't explain why other notable cities like Kyoto were passed over. Answers we will reveal in just a moment, but in any case, according to the official notes from the initial meeting of the Target Committee, the group of civilian scientists and military officials tasked with selecting the intended targets, Tokyo was now practically all bombed and burned out, and is practically rubble, with only the palace grounds left standing. The US Air Force's existing procedure has been to bomb the hell out of Tokyo. The meeting notes, a previously top-secret document dated April 27, 1945, cryptically pointed out. That's why it wasn't chosen for the bomb. There was hardly enough left of it to bomb. Given that the 20th Air Force was systematically laying waste to as many of Japan's cities as they could, and intended to drop 100,000 more tons of bombs by the end of 1945, the Target Committee, according to the notes from that initial meeting, was genuinely concerned that there would be no viable targets left for a proper display of their new bomb's awesome power. In total, the US firebombed a total of 69 Japanese cities, during which time a number of other major cities, including Osaka and Nagoya, were heavily destroyed, while many smaller cities such as Fukuyama, Takeshima, and especially Toyama, 99% of which burned to the ground, were basically wiped off the map by the falling payloads of hundreds of B-29s. The Target Committee would ultimately have to politely ask the 20th Air Force to tone it down, so there might be something left for them. In fact, according to their notes, a major reason the committee gave Hiroshima top priority was because it was the largest untouched target. Hiroshima's size, too, as well as the potential for concentrated destruction due to its mountainous border, were also taken into consideration. But these weren't the only factors that led to the selection of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as targets above so many other cities. Take the city of Kyoto, for example. This urban industrial area, with a population of around 1 million at the time, was seriously considered as a potential target and was actually at the top of the Target Committee's list after they met again on May 10th and 11th. Because of the industry it supported and the overall makeup of its population, the Target Committee believed Kyoto to have a consolidation of Japanese intellectuals, which led them to believe that the citizens of Kyoto would be of higher intelligence generally, and therefore would be able to grasp the significance of atomic power more firmly. Kyoto had also become a relocation destination for numerous people and industries displaced by the destruction that had taken place in other cities. And all this they believed to be a clear advantage in terms of psychological impact. From the beginning, it was the consensus of the Target Committee that psychological factors were highly important to consider during the target selection process. The two main aspects of this element of the process were, 1, how to obtain the greatest psychological effect against Japan, and 2, how to make the initial use of the atomic bomb sufficiently spectacular. To achieve these objectives, the Target Committee placed a high level of emphasis on what they'd begun calling the gadget being appropriately demonstrated on its first deployment. Essentially, they needed the first use of the atomic bomb to 1, work as designed, and 2, strike fear into the hearts of the Japanese. On top of its cultural/psychological significance, Kyoto was also strongly considered as a target because it was a major rail connection between Osaka and Tokyo, and contained several major factories which produced, among other things, military ordnance and aircraft parts. It also contained numerous peacetime factories that had been converted to support the war, and a new aircraft engine factory, the second largest such factory in Japan, that could produce nearly 400 engines per month. In fact, the Target Committee's consideration of Tokyo was serious enough that they created a target map showing the city with a 2.4-kilometer or 1.5-mile circle drawn around a central aiming point, which appeared to be the roundhouse of the railway yards, essentially the service and maintenance hub for the region's locomotives. At this point, things were not looking good for Kyoto. After the second meeting of the Target Committee, their list had Kyoto at number 1, Hiroshima at number 2, Yokohama at number 3, and Kokura at number 4. Then, on May 15th, less than a week after the last Target Committee meeting, an official request was issued to the Air Force asking that Hiroshima, Kyoto, and Niigata all be put on a list of reserved areas that would kindly not be napalmed into oblivion, all so that they could be preserved as targets for the atomic bombs. Well, if Kyoto was such a prime target, you might be wondering, then why wasn't it ultimately selected? Despite it being a highly practical target, Kyoto would end up largely untouched, safe from both any serious firebombing and the atomic option, but not for the reason you might think. Not due to any sort of logistical or strategic disadvantage, but at the urging of the US Secretary of War, General Henry L. Stimson, who had a deep appreciation for Kyoto's historical and cultural heritage. Renowned for its temples, shrines, and traditional architecture, Stimson considered it a cultural treasure. And as the apparent kingpin when it came to these matters, nobody would be able to overrule Stimson except maybe the president. And Stimson made this point clear during a meeting on May 30th with General Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project. They'd met to discuss final target options, and Stimson told Groves plainly that he did not want Kyoto to be turned into a pile of radioactive rubble. Stimson, it turned out, had been Governor General to the Philippines in the late 1920s and had visited Kyoto and loved it. He was also rumored to have gone back there on his honeymoon. Stimson was also fully up to date on what had been happening across Japan and was skeptical, in general, about the indiscriminate bombing tactics being used so freely by the Air Force. So, a week after he met with Groves to secure the safety of his beloved Kyoto once and for all, Stimson took his concerns all the way up to President Truman. Stimson's message to the president consisted of two primary arguments for sparing Kyoto, as well as potentially revising their bombing strategy overall. First, he was worried the US might develop a reputation for being on par with Hitler when it came to wartime atrocities. And second, he was concerned that before the nuclear option was ready to go, the Air Force would have waged such a devastating bombing campaign that the destructive power of their new weapon wouldn't be that big of a deal. Apparently, President Truman laughed, but said he understood. With his personal, ethical, and professional feelings about the situation now clear to both Groves and President Truman, Stimson had one more card to play, and expressed another, more politically minded concern. Stimson feared that if the US unnecessarily destroyed this historical and cultural treasure, the possibility for a future diplomatic relationship with Japan during the long post-war period to come would be lost. It would be in their own best interest, Stimson would point out to President Truman, to have Japan on their side, just in case they got into a dispute with Russia over who should maintain control of Manchuria, a mountainous region of significant strategic value that connects China and Russia. In the end, whether the decision to spare Kyoto was mostly political, personal, or otherwise, this was considered by most to be a good thing. Post-World War II, Kyoto would retain much of its cultural heritage, including its iconic temples and historic structures, which sit amongst many other cultural and historical landmarks, while so many other cities in Japan had to be built up again from the ashes. The Target Committee's last hit, however, included more cities than just Kyoto, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. After the initial meeting of the committee, the list also included Tokyo Bay, Kawasaki, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Kure, Yawata, Kokura, Shimosenka, Yamaguchi, Kumamoto, Fukuoka, and Sasebo. They also noted that any of the targets on this list that had been already destroyed, of which there were many, should be removed. In his personal diary, President Truman comforts himself by saying that he told General Stimson to target only military objectives, not women and children, and that a warning statement would be issued in advance of dropping the atomic bomb. Neither of these happened. despite Truman's personal opinion of the Japanese, which was largely ignorant and hateful. He concluded as the leader of the free world, he could not use this terrible new bomb on Japan's old capital, Kyoto, or its new one, Tokyo. What was unanimously decided early on, it seems, was that Hiroshima would be the first target. With a population of approximately 318,000, Hiroshima had a dense urban center that held a number of military factories. It was also an important transportation hub used regularly by the Japanese army. A bomb dropped near the city center, the target committee concluded, would destroy the majority of Hiroshima's industrial capabilities, would demonstrate the true potential of the bomb, and would hopefully scare the Japanese population into submission. After carefully analyzing weather conditions and maps of the area, Hiroshima was officially selected as the primary target. During later meetings, Kokura, a then crucial hub for the production of military equipment, rifles, artillery, and ammunition, would be selected as the target for the second bomb. However, due to poor visibility caused by thick cloud cover on the morning of August 9th, a last-minute switch was made, and the bomber proceeded on to its secondary target, Nagasaki. Despite the apprehension both Truman and Stimson expressed about bombing civilians, the Target Committee's notes clearly indicated that consideration should be given to large urban areas of not less than 3 miles in diameter existing in the larger populated areas. The committee's final but also contradictory decision was that only small military objectives should be targeted, but they would need to be located in a much larger area. Just in case the bombardiers missed, they didn't want either bomb to go to waste. During these meetings, they also discussed what would happen if the gadget didn't release or the aircraft was too damaged to make the drop. If possible, they concluded the pilot would fly back to base and land as carefully as possible. But if a safe landing didn't seem possible, the pilot would likely need to jettison the bomb from a low altitude into nearby shallow waters. Well, that was the case for Fat Man, anyway, the bomb that would be ultimately dropped on Nagasaki. When it came to Little Boy, the less powerful of the two bombs, the return to base scenario was considerably more complicated, given that a water leak in the bomb's housing would likely result in a nuclear reaction. They would need to perform some tests, the committee members noted, on both active and inactive bombs. While all these smaller decisions were being made, however, President Truman and his advisors were also working on a much bigger decision. And that was, if the atomic option were to become available, were they actually going to use it? As the leadership in Washington saw it, the nuclear option wasn't the only option. If they were indeed going to force an end to this war, they had 4 ways to do it. Option 1. They could continue their barbaric firebombing campaign until there were no cities in Japan left to burn. But they'd already been at this for months, and the emperor still hadn't budged. So the thought of continuing on, business as usual, and expecting a different result didn't seem reasonable. Obviously, you can't burn up a city that's already been largely reduced to ashes. Option 2, invading Japan, was not high on anyone's list, but had started to look somewhat inevitable, unless there was a significant shift in the mindset of the Japanese leadership. The fighting for the Japanese-controlled islands of the Pacific, especially Iwo Jima and Okinawa, had been an eye-opening experience. Enemy forces had consistently chosen to fight to the last man, rather than surrender. A scenario Truman greatly feared would be repeated from one side of the Japanese mainland to the other. Documents discovered in Japan after the war revealed a haunting plan of resistance, where every man, woman, and child, soldiers and civilians, would unite and fight to the very last against the invading Allied forces. First and foremost, President Truman wanted to save as many American lives as possible. But it was his empathy for the women and children of Japan, ironically, that heavily influenced his decision to use the atomic bomb instead of launching a full-scale invasion. Ultimately, the completion of the atomic bomb would add 2 other options on the Allies' table. They could continue firebombing, they could invade Japan, or as a third option, Washington was now considering the possibility of a demonstration, as an alternative to the immediate use of the bomb against Japan, to merely display the atomic bomb's potential power. The scientists and military officials working on the Manhattan Project who'd engineered the Trinity test could, hypothetically, develop another test designed to showcase the bomb's capabilities and hopefully prompt the Japanese leadership to surrender. But this idea faced multiple challenges. For one, there was uncertainty about who would be chosen to witness the detonation and whether it would be effectively persuasive. There were also concerns that the demonstration would backfire and the bomb might fail to go off at all, resulting in an embarrassing fiasco that would instead only encourage Japan to intensify their resistance. And given that only one nuclear device had been successfully detonated by that point, the fear of failure was very real. The limited supply and slow production rate of atomic bombs was also factored into the decision-making process. At the time, only 2 bombs had been produced, meaning that if one failed to go off, there'd be only one left to, hopefully, force Japan's surrender. Truman's military advisors were mostly against the demonstration option, arguing that it might not be sufficiently impactful to compel a full surrender. A technical demonstration simply wouldn't do, they said. Only direct military use of the bombs would get the job done. When we look at it in this way, weighing each option carefully, it can appear as though Truman's decision-making process was long and arduous. But little definitive evidence, other than the conflicting thoughts that appear in his personal diary, have been found to support this. Many historians, in fact, have disregarded the notion that Truman, or Roosevelt for that matter, ever seriously questioned not using the atomic bomb to end the war. The extensive and sometimes heated debates happening in Washington were around how, where, and when to use the bombs, not if. The notes that emerged from the Target Committee's meetings, too, show that their time was mostly dedicated to answering questions surrounding the optimal use of the bomb, as if the decision to use it had already been made. In the end, as we all know, they went with option 4. And on August 6th and August 9th of 1945, a pair of atomic bombs were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing somewhere between 110 and 210,000 people. No one had ever seen this scale of devastation before, not from a single device anyway, and the world was collectively shocked. The atomic bomb dropped in Hiroshima, nicknamed Little Boy, which descended by parachute and detonated approximately 2,000 feet or 610 meters above the city, held around 140 pounds or 64 kilograms of supercharged uranium. It exploded with a force equal to 15,000 tons of TNT, 15 kilotons, and decimated everything within 5 square miles or 8 square kilometers. Roughly 70,000 to 135,000 people were killed in the blast, many instantly, while tens of thousands more died later of their injuries or from radiation exposure. Bomb number 2, nicknamed Fat Man, which detonated over Nagasaki, was built to produce a 22 kiloton explosion, but the overall devastation of Fat Man would actually be less than that seen in Hiroshima, due to the mountainous topography of Nagasaki, which protected it to some degree by reducing the bomb's overall effect. Still, somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 people were killed. But these horrific events have been described, debated, and memorialized since they occurred. The napalming of Tokyo was technically a more deadly attack. So why hasn't Operation Meeting House and the other firebombing campaigns that devastated Japan for months leading up to August of 1945 endured so thoroughly in the world's collective memory? The simplest answer is that firebombing just isn't as head-turning. A consistent campaign that slowly raises the death toll over time is overshadowed by the cataclysmic power of a single bomb. Unlike for Hiroshima or Nagasaki, there's no publicly funded museum in Japan's capital officially commemorating the burning of Tokyo. Since it occurred, the bombing of Dresden has too maintained a more prominent place in our history, and was the subject of considerable public debate, mostly about morality and warfare. Even so, the mention of Tokyo, Dresden, or Guernica, Spain do not immediately bring to mind the devastation reaped upon them. Their mention does not make us shudder in the same way the names Hiroshima and Nagasaki have for more than 3/4 of a century. What about the name Malta? This island country, situated roughly in the center of the Mediterranean Sea, about 80 kilometers or 50 miles south of Italy, because of its proximity to North Africa, was of high strategic importance to both the Axis and the Allies at the start of World War II. From 1940 to 1942, the German and Italian navies and air forces battled the British Royal Navy, Royal Air Force, and the Maltese people for control of the island. During this time, the densely populated capital city of Valletta and its adjacent harbor, measuring just over 1 square mile or just less than 2 square kilometers in total, were subjected to the most sustained and concentrated bombing campaign in history. When their attempts to bomb and starve the opposition into surrendering didn't work, the combined Italian and German forces settled for decimating the island's infrastructure so thoroughly that it would have no further military use. Ultimately, the Allies and Maltese people achieved victory, but it came at a heavy cost. During the 2.5-year contest, the Allies lost 716 airplanes, 1 battleship, 2 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, 19 destroyers, 38 submarines, and about 2,300 airmen were killed or wounded, while 1,300 Maltese civilians were killed. Thousands more were wounded, and 30,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. What happened in Malta, Japan, Dresden, Guernica, and many other places has shown us that large-scale aerial bombing will not eventually demoralize an enemy to the point of surrender. The opinions of many experts seem to have changed. If you relentlessly bomb a people and their cities, they won't simply give up and become compliant. In fact, in the face of this sort of indefensible attack, they tend to become more rigid and determined in their opposition. But what do you think? Is aerial bombing an effective strategy in modern warfare? Why doesn't the firebombing of Tokyo hold a more prominent place in the history of World War II? Let us know in the comments below. And if this video interested you, check out our video on the US government's Doomsday Survival Plan revealed, or simulating a nuclear war between Russia and NATO. Thanks for watching.